Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first breakfast session for this year. Yes, sorry, it's a little bit late in starting this year. We've had a few events already, and I've seen many of you there already this year, so that's great. But this is the first breakfast for the year. We've got plans for another 7 this year, so stay tuned to your email, which I'm sure you are, and I'll be sending out invitations in the coming weeks. So I'm very happy this month, to welcome Associate Professor Orr Vered from Flinders University down the road here in Adelaide. And she's going to speak to us on developing advanced literacy inside the disciplines and across the curriculum. Before we get started, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country. Excuse me. I'd like to acknowledge this meeting is being held on traditional Kaurna lands and we pay our respects to the Kaurna people and their elders past and present. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Karen, and we'll take some questions in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the session. So thanks very much, Karen.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me. I'm really honored to have received the invitation to come and talk at this really large gathering. So I'm very impressed with this series and what you pull together and sustain, which is really nice. So I think I'll just start with a few words about my background in terms of my relationship with writing. So I began my career as a journalist in radio and television, and I gained a lot of experience there writing for the spoken word. Ultimately, I became a news photographer and an editor for television, so making and editing the video images that were set to the narration track, the journalist's track. So this was in the early 1980s, and I rather quickly became unhappy with the industry's sexism at the time. And at that time, quite surprisingly, even in journalism, women were to be looked at, and they were preferred on screen rather than behind the camera. So only 5% of the workforce doing what I was doing were female, nationally in the United States, and mainly in non-union houses, non-union shops at the time. So that was interesting, anyway, or it is interesting. But I just decided, well, I didn't have that pioneer grit for that job at that time. And I did a bunch of traveling and knocking about. And then I went back and I studied for a master's in cultural anthropology. And it was there that I got a job at Temple University, working in the writing center, the University Writing Center, working with student writers. And I was hired because they had a need for someone who could help the students in the radio, TV, and film school writing for the spoken word. As it turned out, I never actually worked with any of those students. It just didn't happen. But it was a career-forming experience to work there for a couple of years under a gentleman named Frank Sullivan, under his directorship. So I guess I just want to give that as a brief introduction to myself, in a sense, so what my pre-academic career was, in a sense. And I'm happy to talk about writing centers at the end if anyone's interested. So to start, I guess a few fundamental assumptions that inform my teaching practice and my research on teaching and learning, and how I go about developing advanced literacy inside my discipline. And I think that my approach can be applied quite broadly across disciplines, right? In different disciplines. So I, believe that writing as a part of literacy, so we could say literacy broadly, but writing in specific is one of the most powerful tools that humans have. And secondly, that writing is thinking. And third, that the most important thing that I can do is to help my students become better writers. Whether they learn the ins and outs of the Australian broadcasting mediascape and so forth, and business, and I mean, that's less important to me because they're going to go and do so many different things in their lives. What you study at university does not set your life forever, and you need to have that flexibility. So, but the thing is, we seem to have a writing problem. As academics, we seem to have a writing problem, or so we think. Increasingly, I believe that the alleged writing problem is actually one of perception, and to a degree that is our perception as academics, as instructors, not the students. So in the humanities, social sciences, education, law, business courses, a majority of assessment is in written form, and instructors identify writing as a key challenge for students. But consequently, writing becomes the focus, right? And it becomes a challenge for teaching. But at the same time, assessment of student reading practices occurs less frequently and with much less confidence on our behalf. So we most often assess reading through writing. So it becomes difficult to tell if it's the reading or the writing that troubles us or troubles our students. So we don't assess reading itself or even a reasonable likeness of reading. And given the increasing size of class cohorts, the numbers of students that we're expected to assess in a term, few of us have the time to discriminate between oral contributions in class that are productive, insightful, reflective, or otherwise excellent, and the kind of comments that students offer up in a, look at me, I came to class today kind of tenor, right? So a lot of student contribution in class can just be to be noted, to have said something. And that's not what we're looking for. We actually want what they say to be more substantial, more reflective of an engagement with the materials. So participation marks can be fuzzy. They can be ineffective, really, unrepresentative. So when we assess reading and reasoning, it's usually in written form. We do it through the writing. And that is, to me, it's like no wonder we have a writing problem. So it's the only activity that we can point our finger at. And I think it's a bias of recognition related to, say, selective attention. You know, writing is the mechanism through which and reasoning are presented to instructors, and it's writing that becomes the object of our concern almost exclusively. So I'd also add that in sciences, writing often becomes more important at the postgraduate level, and it's only at the advanced stage that the writing problem is revealed sometimes in the sciences. So student writing is inexorably linked with reading and to critical thinking. And to grow better writers, we need to work that nexus of reading, thinking, and writing as linked practices. I've just put up a couple of references here. Reading resilience, the skill of reading complex aesthetic and rhetorical texts with patience, perseverance, understanding, and appreciation. That's the aim. That's one of our aims. And have a look at Ellen Carrillo's work on mindful reading. Also, Alice Horning's work on reading is very important. So I teach in screen and media studies, and my focus is on developing student practices in reading, thinking, and writing with nonfiction texts. Okay, so the kind of research and analysis that we produce rather than, say, in a literary studies class or another kind of reading that students are actually more familiar with, right? So the first-year students particularly are not familiar with reading nonfiction with the analytical stance and with the mindfulness. So to bridge this, I think we need to start by making reading visible. Okay, so this is one of the first things we need to do. And I encourage recognition of reading's material dimensions, not just its mental dimensions. So I talk to my students about writing on their texts. I give them tools. In the beginning of the semester, in my first lecture, I pepper the lecture by giving out gifts. I give out spiral notepads. When I talk about taking notes, I then give out a notepad, just one or two to 100, a group of 100. When I talk about being prompt in class, I give out those university coffee cups, just to kind of, give it a material, it's what do they call it? It's that materiality. Sometimes a totem or a talisman or something. I give Post-it flags. I give highlighter pens. So there I am. One day I'll probably get in trouble for chucking highlighter pens in the lecture hall, but until that day. So I want to talk about that actual physical engagement with the text, and I encourage students to print. Sorry, I do believe in the paper. I don't think that we have developed a great set of skills around annotating digital texts. So I say, look, if you want, because all the readings are online, that's how they get the readings. But I say, it might be good to print them out so you can bring them to class if you don't have an iPad. If you're reading them at home on a desktop computer or at the library on a desktop computer, you actually need to bring your readings to class, the physical thing, in some form. So great, I recommend annotation for those who have something portable, but I also don't think reading them on the small screen of the phone is as productive. So again, I talk about those things, talk about the size of the screen they're reading on and the availability of the text as a material object. So I talk about reading as a purposeful activity, encouraging students to see themselves as members of a discursive community, inviting them in. So again, talking about the text as a conversation. And now you're a member of this community, so we invite you into this conversation, and this is how you might engage. I also begin the semester by talking plainly and honestly about higher education. And I give them some readings about the economics of higher education, the economics of the job market, and how sometimes these things are not in concert with one another, and that we're operating through a set of myths. And I try to suggest to them that they don't need to believe all of those myths, and they don't need to be worried about whether they will be employed and about whether this degree will get them a job or not. That being at university in itself, is a process that will be of value to you no matter what you do, and you will do so many more things in your life than my generation has done. So also introducing the rhetorical structures and patterns of the disciplinary discourse, talking about readings and text, and I do this in the lecture. Okay, so not just in the tutorial, but in the lecture, and I know there's research that shows that students take the lecture material more seriously than they do the tutorial material for some reason. So bringing some of the things that you might imagine should only be done in tutorials into the larger lecture situation and doing it there, but also reiterating it and doing it in the tutorial. So there's a doubling up. So how do we teach deep reading of nonfiction? And on the axis of assessment, then, how do we increase student accountability for reading? And I don't have a snappy answer for how we assess or monitor reading as reading without deploying, an EEG or something like that, mapping brain activity, which I'm not going to participate in. But that, maybe the LMS systems will have some kind of innovation like that in the near future. But I think that the strategies that I deploy in my classroom can be adopted, adapted, might be helpful to others. So I take my pedagogical cues from two areas: writing across the curriculum, which I've practiced my entire career, and actually on reflecting about my education, I actually think that even from primary school in the 1960s, this was part of my educational experience, because I happened to grow up in the Bay Area outside of San Francisco, and there was a writing across the curriculum group very early on. And I do believe that all the school teachers would have done continuing education around this stuff at that time. And there was very much a big debate around whole language and phonics and stuff, and there were a lot of innovations happening at that time, and I just think that I might have been fortunate to have had the benefits of that. The second area, besides writing across the curriculum, is shared inquiry, which I've adopted more recently. So shared inquiry is something that I've just taken on in the last couple of years and am working with, and I find it very powerful. So writing across the curriculum, and the U.S. tradition of composition and rhetoric instruction recommends scaffolding writing assignments, drafting in class, so using tutorial time to do writing and talk about writing. Writing as a public and collaborative process. So when you bring it into the classroom and you ask students to exchange papers, you have made writing a collaborative and a public process. It is not something you do all by yourself, or maybe at the learning center, right? But you subject it, as we do as academics, to a discussion. Peer feedback on drafts, and writing as an iterative process. So drafting, redrafting. Writing is rewriting. So among first-year students, I have found that very few of them have swapped papers and read their peers' work before they come to my class. So in high school, this does not appear to be a common process for the students I have at Flinders University. And that is surprising to me and disappointing, really. So that's something, they've been taught that writing is an individual practice rather than a collaborative one, and I think that's really mistaken and misunderstood. So I often also open up, in the classroom, I open up a file and I show them how the last paper that I had published had been through 14 drafts, or whatever. I just show them my files on the server, trying to, say we're all in this doing the same thing. So in tutorials, we discuss openly and collaboratively what the question or the prompt for writing is asking, and different ways to approach that response. So, they have a task set on the reading. They've got a question about the reading that they're going to write 500 words about. And they're going to bring that to class as a draft. But before they do that, we talk about that question. And we come as a group really to understand, well, what's the question about and what might some possible starters be? So kind of giving templates, developing them in the class. And in a sense, it felt, when I started doing this, it felt a bit like giving them the answer, but I actually don't mind. I don't mind telling them, after they've tried to work it themselves, to say, yep, but the author's also saying this and stuff, and I think that's really important, and trying to guide them to the emphasis, perhaps, if they've missed it. So yeah, there's a lot of preparation before they write, and then they bring in their drafts, and the thing is, it removes anxiety, right? Feeling more confident about the material. They become better writers because they understand the material. So that's back to the reading, understanding the reading better. Understanding the material that they're meant to be working with in their own writing. So if you don't understand it, how can your writing be clear? So we have to get to that space. I think that in literature classes and perhaps in religious studies and in philosophy, bringing the reading to the classroom and talking about it in that way might be more common. But I find that with a lot of nonfiction work, it isn't discussed in that way. It's not treated as something to be interpreted. But I'm trying to teach students that you need to interpret even something that is put forward to you as factual, as scientific, as a piece of research. Yeah? So I think about this as writing the reading, write about the reading, writing the reading. And I think it's a powerful experience that teaches strategies for focalizing reading and connecting reading practice to disciplinary discourse and writing. So I use writing to learn, writing to learn strategies. If writing is thinking, we can learn by writing. That's the idea. you learn the disciplinary content by writing with and about that content. Learning how to do the discipline by participating in it. And it's a kind of active learning, right? And utilizing low to medium stakes writing tasks. So I have eschewed the first year essay. I don't want to read 5 pages or 7 pages. I want to read page and a half, 2 pages, related to what we've read together. I want to see the students thinking very specifically, so I set questions that are very specifically driven back to the text. So, writing to learn tasks are generally low to medium stakes writing tasks. You can have them without any grade value, or low grade value. So with the drafts, I give 5% for bringing your draft to class and submitting it to a peer review. And then the actual final draft of the paper is only worth 10%. So that, relative weight on that process, on that public activity and collaborative activity. So low stakes writing, this is University of Waterloo. It's just a nice, concise statement. Low stakes writing encourages student involvement in course ideas, helps students keep up with the readings and put content in their own words, and helps instructors to see whether or not students are understanding course material and prepares students for high stakes assignments. And that's also an example of how we assess reading with writing, but low stakes writing. And so sometimes I have them just write in class, in the lecture actually, and I collect it at the end. And for the students who haven't come to the lecture, they've got 24 hours to send it to me digitally, if they are online students. So writing to learn tasks, whether they're done in class or outside, also are assessment for learning, not of learning. They are expressive writing, not transactional writing. And it's like writing to yourself or thinking on paper. So you can use class reflection journals, discussion prompts or questions, minute papers, post-class reflections, which can be submitted online, letter to next year's students. Those are kind of sort of an array of activities that would fall into that category. So by not transactional, what I mean is that they're not meant to get something done between people as a transaction, but are more about communicating with yourself as a thinker. Yeah? So some of this stuff might be like, what's the most interesting thing I learned today and why? What was the thing that struck me? And so write about, 5 minutes, write about that. It's easy to assess because you're not marking grammar and things like that. You're just looking at the thinking. And the grammar's better when they know what they're talking about. It just doesn't get in the way. So I deploy these writing to learn work to work the course material, to develop understanding and critical perspectives on the readings. And it's about content mastery rather than genre mastery. So it's open to all genres, right? So you can have these kind of things like letters or journals, so a variety of tasks. And I think they also orient students towards the disciplinary processes of research methods, reasoning, and the doing of the discipline. And the small tasks prepare them for then more complex writing assignments, and so you can use them to scaffold. Medium stakes writing tasks are specific to shared readings. Let's see if I have a, nope, I don't. I thought I had a medium stakes slide there, but low to medium stakes. And so when you ask a question, why does Luzecki argue X and such in her 2001 article? That's a medium stakes question. So you need to have read the article, you need to have understood it, but you need to have understood it in that sense of why is she going about this? Why does she bother? Yeah. So it's a different level of kind of thinking through it. But you don't have to do outside research. It's about one text. It's about that very specific thing, and the student's been pointed to what it is they should be looking at. So what I do is a given text is worked in this kind of a cycle. Week 1, students read the assigned text outside of class. The next week, week 2, that is part of the lecture, right? So I'm lecturing on the relevant concepts, the context, perhaps why is this important, why is this an interesting question in the field, or something like that. And that same week, the tutorial discussion will be dedicated to that text. The third week, nothing to do with that text, but we start the cycle of the next one begins, right? Because what they're doing is thinking through their writing task in that third week with the first reading. So week 4, they bring a draft to class of their reading response to the tutorial. And so that's what happens that week. They get their feedback, they go away, and they submit that 500-word reading response in week 5. So they've had 5 weeks to work that material by themselves, in class, with their peers, with me, etc. Okay, you might still be asking, okay, well, so where's this accountability for reading that's not instantiated by writing? And, excellent question. So I'm using a method called shared inquiry. This is where shared inquiry comes into it. And shared inquiry I use in the tutorial discussion sections to engage students in developing a community of inquiry, perceiving themselves as a member of a community of inquiry, participating in a collaborative learning experience around the text and with one another. So it's a method for exploring ideas and learning, and whatever that may mean for the individual. Where are you in your learning? Where are you in your understanding about this? And can you have a transformation of your own, right? Not everyone will be changed in the same way or respond in the same way. So the method comes to us from John Dewey, Matthew Lipman, and some of you might know these concepts through Philip Cam's work in Philosophy for Children, or for Philosophy for Schools, and Cam follows Lipman. So the idea of shared inquiry is that everyone comes to class having read the text with questions. So I actually go around the classroom having talked about the materiality of reading and annotation and so forth. In the beginning of the semester in the tutorials, I go around and I check to see that people have scribbled on their texts. And that they've brought them. Did you bring the reading? What did you highlight? This kind of thing. And just reinforce it with a little bit of vigilance. And then you don't have to do it after 1 or 2 sessions. You don't have to go around and look. Then they work in small groups. They've brought questions to class. They work in small groups. And that is another way to encourage accountability. Far more accountable to their peers than they are to me, I think. So they work in small groups, which also helps the students who are less comfortable speaking in a large group. So I've had very good experience with this, where the kids who have come even with access plans who say, I don't have to talk in a large group, right? Have come up to me after the class and said, working in this small group was really good. I felt very comfortable, and then I was able to speak in the big group, which is so nice. I mean, that's why you do the job. I mean, absolutely. Just makes you feel really good, because that's something that person can take away. And again, has nothing to do with content. A lot of them are there, to develop. They have a lot of different developmental paths that we're part of, So they talk about their question, and then each of those small groups puts a question up on the board, up on the whiteboard. So we might have 4 or 5 questions on the whiteboard about that same text. And then we vote which one we'll start with, and that's how we start the discussion. So they own this. They've generated it. I haven't brought a question into tutorial. I haven't set a question for tutorial. They're responsible for it. So part of the shared inquiry is about also learning to listen and building on your peers' remarks. So I've observed shared inquiry where students have been, in other instructors' classes, students have been rewarded for inviting someone in. So we're talking, you're speaking to me, we're all in a circle and part of the discussion, but then I say, oh, Stuart, that was really interesting what you said. Can you say some more about that? Or how would you address X and such? Or what does, in light of that, what do you think about a three-wheeled skateboard? Yeah? So then I've invited you in. That means I was I had to listen well enough to invite you back in. So the student who has listened well and invited someone in got a tick, So there are a lot of ways you can use this process. So the instructor is a facilitator rather than the discussion leader. And the demand for textual evidence keeps the discussion focused on critical reasoning rather than impression. So when you are making a comment about the ideas in the text, you need to be able to point to a passage in the text or a phrase in the text that has led you to that understanding, right? So when you're making a contribution to this discussion, and that's something that the instructor can do, can say, well, Stuart, where in the text do you find that idea expressed most powerfully for you? Something like that. Or would you like to share with me some of the things that you've highlighted around that idea? So again, getting them back to the text, back to the text, back to the text. And that is a lot of, engagement, I think. So this is where I say the goal isn't to achieve consensus or agree on a singular meaning for the text, but to put as much emphasis on listening to how others have interpreted it, right? Listening to the way other people understood it. And through this, I have actually found myself learning more in my classes because I think I'm trained to read in a certain way as an academic, and I think the students orient me differently sometimes and give me insights that I wouldn't have picked up on. And then I can have aha moments as well about the text that I have set in my own syllabus, which is really nice. So you bring a question or two about the tutorial, small groups, nominate a question. They're posted, the class votes to the which sequence we're going to start in, and students begin the discussion, and the instructor really needs to remain silent. So you just want to sort of maybe move those silence, fill in the silent moments with a question rather than a statement. And when I've seen, the best facilitator I saw of shared inquiry actually removed herself from the table, made herself very small and silent, and I was reminded of the movie Gorillas in the Mist, where Diane Fossey makes herself really tiny so that, the silverback doesn't kill her. But this instructor, made herself really small at the table so that she wasn't dominating the discourse and dominating the room, and the kids were owning it. She was stunning. So let's see, what else have I got to say so I can just finish up, I think. So these are some photos of the classrooms that St. Mary's College of California has for shared inquiry. So these are the classrooms where they use this process in their seminar. And they have these fabulous circular tables so everyone can see everyone. And they have name tags. Everyone's got a name tag, so you call one another by name. And this is really helpful for me. More helpful for me than it is for the students, honestly, because I'm teaching 100 students. I can't remember their names. But because I use the name tags, I do learn their names much better. So the benefits. Shared inquiry encourages and develops close and critical reading practices. It encourages collaborative learning and problem solving, thinking through a text, thinking about what we might do with the ideas the text has given us. It encourages positive listening practices, I think. Focuses reading activity toward that kind of reasoning that we want to develop. I think it facilitates a more equitable classroom experience as well. And combined with the writing to learn activities, I think reading and reasoning can be unified in this way. And I am finding that my students are far more engaged. They are, they're happy. I have a lot more students coming back to my second year class because of the experience they've had in the first year. And I'm not doing the thing, I'm setting up something that they do. And I think they're feeling really good about the doing, you know, and they own it, and they own the process, and they feel like they're learning and they're growing up. Anyway, getting lots of positive feedback from the students. So I'm happy to keep doing this, and I am seeing improvement in writing if they come to the classroom activities. So if they're coming to the discussion, the tutorial discussion, if they're coming to the writing workshop prepared, in both cases I'm saying coming prepared, not just breathing, they do better. They do better. And they're also more engaged. I have more students coming into my office also asking, how can I improve? So more students coming to the office hours to, which I think is a reflection of their commitment and of their sense of belonging to the process. Anyway, I think I'm going to end there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was very good. And I think anyone who's marked an enormous pile of first-year undergrad essays will enjoy some of your ideas, especially on the shortening length of that first assignment. Very good. So does anyone in the room have some questions for Karen? No. Well, if you do, please put your hand up because we have a couple of questions online, if you allow. Okay, we have a double-barreled question from Peter Balan. He asked, for peer review and feedback on drafts, what instructions/templates are given to students?
Yes, that would have been a good thing to have brought along today. That is in a constant state of revision, so I'm continuously working on improving that. It is a challenge. I have, in the first assignment, so maybe I should say, I ask my students to do 4 of these short writing assignments, so I'm marking 4 small assignments across the semester. So the first one, I say to them, and there is a template, I do have a set of instructions about how to give feedback, and it emphasizes positivity, helpfulness, and getting to the big ideas. And the structure, the logic, paragraph formation, topic sentences. So these are things that my students are challenged by. So in the first instance, the first assignment, I say, I don't want you to write on the paper. The reader does not write, only the writer writes. So you bring a hard copy, you bring 3 hard copies of your paper to class. You exchange it with 3 peers, so everyone's reading 3 other papers. As a reader, you may make a marginal note, a star, a tick, a question mark. You may underline an awkward sentence, not crossing out and putting in alternative phrasing or any of that. So not editing, but much more around big ideas, the structure of the paragraph. Does the topic sentence align with what you ultimately have done, the job that that paragraph has achieved? That kind of thing. On the second assignment, I allow the readers, the peer reviewers, if you will, to make a little bit more notation. obviously in a class of 100, multiple cohorts, you have a lot of variety as to where the students are and what kind of instruction they need. Have had students come to my office and say, I didn't really get very good peer feedback. I didn't get much help from my peers. So then I kind of look around and I have a look at the assignment and see, well, how did they do? And I suggest, well, maybe you should sit in a different part of the classroom next week and choose other people to swap papers with. So mix it up. And I have made suggestions to students of particular peers that they might want to sit next to. So, sometimes you're managing a little bit. I could possibly send you my instructions as they exist now if you wanted to share them with people online.
That would be appreciated. Thanks.
Yeah, because I can't remember exactly all the phrasing.
Okay, Peter also asks if you have any examples from other fields where this approach has been applied.
Well, it's very much, shared inquiry comes out of the traditions, as I said, of the philosophy for children, or philosophy for schools, bringing a kind of discussion about big ideas, not content memorization, but discussion of big ideas, why this matters, why might we be interested in this, why might we care, okay? So that's one of the background areas. The other one is the great books tradition, or Western civilization kind of studies that are dying out now. I mean, great books was popular in the United States sort of through the post-war period, and my impression is now that the Catholic universities and colleges are the only place where that kind of tradition still exists. So with St. Mary's College, they have this seminar program. Every student takes the seminar every year of their studies. And this is a place where you read great works and you just sit around and talk about them. And I think this comes, in that context, comes from the, sorry, I'm not a Catholic and I'm forgetting the phrase, the social justice agenda that the brothers have, right? That the historical foundations of the college and their approach to studying. Yeah, so the social justice agenda leads them to continue to believe that this is important work. Notre Dame in the U.S. also continues to have this tradition, similar kind of thing. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thanks. Okay, Jordana asked the same question, so I hopefully we've covered that for Jordana.
There's someone up the back here that has a question.
Okay. Hang on. I'll just, no, people online need to hear. Yep.
A movie star. Okay. Hope that sounds okay. My question is, as I listen to what you said and all those pearls of wisdom that I like to call them, I sat there thinking to myself, how is this any different to my online discussion that I offer my students at the moment? And so my question to you will be, how has what you've just described any different to the online discussion forum? And just to pick up on one of the comments you made earlier about giving rewards, one of the things I do in online discussion is as I go through all the discussion, I don't participate in the discussion, I watch it. But after the discussion's closed and all the students have given their views, I go back and pick out some what I call pearls or gems. The comments that have value added something outside of the spectrum that if the other students were to go that way, they get the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with your concept about big ideas on online in this discussion as opposed to the minutiae. So my question after the verbose question is, do you see online discussion as being any different to what you've just described in the tutorial and the lectures? Thank you.
I now have to out myself as a media studies scholar who doesn't much like the online. I don't teach online. It hasn't been a requirement. I have told my students that the online discussion space in the learning management system is for them, not me. I don't participate in it. If they want to use it, they may. I feel very strongly strongly that what my students need is face-to-face participation. The majority of my students are school leavers. The majority of them are domestic students. Locally, I don't know. I mean, this might, you know, institutionally, different institutions are shaped differently. They have different student groups with different needs. So, yeah, my practice has been contoured by the cohort that I'm addressing. But I think that's fantastic if your online discussions are having that robust, ideas focused, you know, that they're that engaged. That's really fantastic. I often read out in class, with students' permissions, the best opening paragraphs. So with the reading responses, I'll sometimes say, I just want to read to you a gem of an introductory paragraph, and just listen to how so-and-so has presented these complex ideas in her own words, you know? And they like it. And that's one of the things they really like about the peer review process as well. They say they learn a lot from reading other people's writing, even if it isn't stellar writing. So it gives them a moment to think about what they think, and it gives them a moment to gauge themselves, I think. Yeah.
Another question from the
I
room.
hope I answered your question.
Thanks, Karen. I think this is more of a comment than a question, really. You're unique if you've got more high school students in your classes at Flinders than most other people there.
In first year?
Yeah, we've got 40%. I know, because I look at the stats all the time. 40 to 45% high school students in classes in first year. I'll show you the stats when we get back.
No, I believe you.
And I do think what you've talked about translates well into the online space. I can see lots of opportunities, as you've pointed out, that enable it to be translatable to an online space, particularly because you give the students so much agency in what they're doing. I think if you're working in an online space, you will have to be much, much more present and much, much more vigilant about getting students involved and engaged. But I can see translation into an online space that would work quite well. And that might just be my, you know, rosy glasses envisionment, but if that's a word. But I do think that it would work really
helpful.
well.
I believe that if someone says to me, I see value in this for this other place, then I too will probably be more optimistic about that. I hadn't really thought about it, Anne. The agency, connecting it to the agency is really valuable.
Thanks for your talk, Karen. I found it really interesting. You just mentioned you mainly have domestic students. So how do you cope with those students who are international, or perhaps English is not their first language?
I don't know if I'm following policy in this space. I will assess the individual. And I don't believe that there's a singular standard for written English that every one of my students needs to meet at the same time. And I know this. I just marked a batch of papers, and I gave an international student whose English is not perfect by any means, but he understood complex text and returned a good representation of that I could understand. And that got a very, a mark that was in the bulk, if you will, right? It was where the majority of students were. And I don't think that the sentence level English was where the majority of students' sentence level English was, but I don't think that's the standard that I should be applying to that individual at this point in that individual's study career, if you will. I don't think it would be helpful. And I do write on their papers and I say, you know, please go to the Learning Lounge and ask them for help with pronoun use, you know, definite articles, and I write down that stuff. And so I put on their paper, take this paper, and these are, or subject-verb agreement, I write a couple of things for them to get help with, and I suggest that. And I also invite them into my office if they would rather have the help from me. You know. Yep. Did I answer the question?
Just wait one moment.
Thanks. That kind of answers it. The other part would be engagement. So if my language is perhaps not the same standard in terms of my writing ability as my peers, will I participate?
Yes, I find that the oral participation is fine. So, yeah, I don't have that issue. I have a lot of second language speakers, you know, multilingual students. Some of whom have been in Australia for a long, long time. Others are international students, you know, younger people who are going to go back home. I guess my feeling is that that a lot of the students are also, they understand the classroom as a place to practice their English comfortably, happily. I have to say, my students are so kind to one another. They are so much more kind than I remember being as a student, than I remember my peer group being. And it's very interesting because I think at Flinders University I have a much more diverse group of students. I think I went to a kind of, I would say, a monocultural kind of university as an undergraduate. We were all kind of the same, you know. And I think there's a lot more variety at Flinders University, and yet they are very, very tolerant and helpful and supportive of one another. So that applies with the students with disabilities, the students with severe anxiety disorders, the students who speak, you know, English as a second, third, fourth language, you know. So I think, I don't know, I feel lucky in that way.
Hi. We work in the vet space, so quite different to the university space, but we see the students generally after high school, before they generally hit the tertiary scene, particularly if there's a void in their own assessment of their ability to go straight into the tertiary system. So I guess I have two questions, maybe comments. The first one is, what work is being done with the high schools to support them to better prepare their students for this educational system? Because in the vet sector, I can tell you right now, there is a massive void between what you're talking about and even their ability to participate in what you're talking about and what we're dealing with when they come out of high school. And the assessments that we do around their language learning and literacy skills, their numeracy skills, and the results that we see from high school graduates are really quite distressing, probably is the right word, and the work that we do with them to prepare them even to be able to do a Cert 3, Cert 4 level qualification. So I guess that's probably my first question. And the other part of the question I wanted to talk about is in the vet sector, we're very closely engaged with industry. We are a direct link between education and employment outcomes. I think it's really fair to say that industry is accepting a much lower level of writing in day-to-day function because of the such diverse range of students or people in the workforce. Our culture has become quite diverse in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, that I think industry is allowing for that a little bit more. So we're not having to hit those commas in the right places and grammatically perfect kind of structured work. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Sorry, that's kind of two very different questions, but...
Look, language changes all the time. and the kind of language that is the type of writing, the style of writing, the kind of language that's used in business or marketing or, law, for instance. They're all subcultures with their own kind of vernaculars and their own standards and practices. That's a genre question, in sense that, if you know the language and if you are familiar with different genres and if you've read them, you should be able to work in them. I'm not saying you're going to be an expert at producing them, but, how do you think lawyers learn to write like that? Someone teaches them to write like that so that nobody else understands what they're talking about. Yeah? I'm kidding. No, but when I read something legal, I do find the sentence construction is different, and, it's a little more complicated. It's not what I read all the time. It's, but that's no different from, I often have to tell students who speak Italian or Spanish or Romanian as a first language, something I have to say, look, that's okay in Spanish to have a sentence this long, but it's not okay in English. And we have a much more staccato construction, shorter, and this could be 3 sentences. And it's all right. The ideas are all good, so cut it here, cut it here. That's just, that's not a problem. We can do that. But, if you're suggesting there's a dumbing down broadly in society, look, we could just blame Rupert Murdoch, we can blame the kind of generic text that we read all the time. There are, economics behind some of this kind of stuff. There aren't the sub-editors in journalism that there used to be, so journalism isn't written in as beautifully. Journalistic writing is a bit sloppy these days. But the other question, or the other issue, gosh, I haven't read the report about the NAP plan. But not having read it, of course, I have an opinion. So I think that there are things to be worried about in terms of what's going on in primary and secondary schooling. I'm not a fan of Year 12 exams. I'm not a fan of that kind of summative knowledge testing. But that is the system. Maybe it'll get unwound. I worry about the NAP plan. But one of the things that I'd like to do, I'm very much trying to invite Professor Alice Horning, who's a reading expert, over next year from the U.S. to talk about reading. And I would hope that in that, thank you. I would hope that if we were able to bring Alice over, that she could give a public talk that we would invite secondary school teachers to around issues of reading. So I think there needs to be more engagement between the university and the secondary schools. And, make those connections. I have colleagues in New South Wales. Sydney Uni tries to keep connections with the English teachers, Secondary English Teachers Association and stuff. And, I'm looking to do some of those things myself. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the sub-bachelor is looking like an interesting space. That's another day, isn't it?
Okay, we have one.
Yes.
Sorry, very, very quick. This is the school perspective of this side of things. Look, we are very much driven by the external metrics, incredibly narrow plan ATAR. Yeah.
Thank you.
Teachers know things are not conducive to long-term outcome. The stakeholders, managers, the marketers, the parents, value the NAT plan result and the grade. We chase things directly. In terms of literacy, that means very much that we are editing rather than developing those other skills. The students value the grade above, as do the parents, and teachers are scrutinized according to those things. Fortunately, we are slave to those things, despite knowing those are not in the best interest of our learners. And in terms of the reading amongst kids, again, we are doing a lot of things that are directly pursuing improving NAT plan reading and writing results, and I'd suggest that to a large extent kills students' motivation to read, which impacts their writing ability. Again, apologise for the comment, but
I agree.
Okay, last question. Thank you.
Again, it's just a comment really. I want to underline what the guy just before me said. We did some work a couple of years ago about students' expectations and experiences going from high school, predominantly high school, into university. And we tried to engage high schools in that work, and we tried to go into high schools to talk to them about how they might, in inverted commas, improve things for students coming out of high school. We were hit with a brick wall. Partly that wasn't the staff in schools, that was the headmasters who had to meet all of the things you've just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And also, if they're not in high schools where they're trying to get students to get high ATARs to get into good universities, ATARs being the entrance score to get into universities, a lot of the time what they're doing in lower socioeconomic areas, and I'm quoting high school teachers now, we're doing crowd control. Yeah. So I don't think we can blame high schools. They're doing the best they can in a really hard space. And I think it's what we as academics and teachers need to do at universities and in the vet sectors and even in high schools is teach the people in front of us and work with those students. And that comes from a load of literature where that's been said a number of times.
No, that's true. We do have to teach the students that we have, but at the same time, I think that we need to collaborate with secondary and vet. I take your point. And I have collaborated with vet. I mean, I actually was the person who instigated the first teaching collaboration between Flinders University and TAFE. And we now have many, many degrees. So in 2002, I think it was, I mean, when I came here in 1999, I couldn't believe that the divide between TAFE and the university was as it was. Having come from California, where there's this community college 2-year program that articulates with the University of California system, was designed to articulate with the university, the highest level of university. So, you know, develop some of those relationships because of the resource issues. TAFE had certain resources that we didn't have. And it was a great sharing. I think that it has taken on a different shape. I wouldn't call it sharing anymore. I think it's a bit different. So collaborating with secondary school teachers and with TAFE, but I think educating the parents, I find that when I talk with parents, they are, and this primary school, parents of primary school children, they're not willing to argue with the schools, and they haven't been educated about the emphasis in the system, and they think that that's what's meant to be done, or that's all they can do because that's what they've been told the schools are doing. And they don't fight back. They don't say, stop testing my kid. I'd actually like my child to be reading a book a week, a fiction. You know, I want my child to be reading fiction book a week, and it doesn't have to be on your list or this or that, you know. But, yeah, what can you do? I mean, you know, it's all very top-down, and we are, you know, everyone's trying to keep their job and keep their kid in school, and, yeah, so it's a difficult, delicate balance. But opportunity for change, I think there's a lot of opportunity. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Karen. That was very good. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us online, and we'll see you next month. And thanks everybody for coming along. It was great to see you all, and thanks for participating in a terrific discussion at the end there. So thanks again, Karen.
Thank you.